So I feel like I should have brought live animals or done an interpretive dance, but here we go. Walking the Plank, a land protection tale from the Upper Lehigh. A story where I will try to give you the facts and you can draw your own conclusions. Our story starts at the Thomas Darling Preserve in Tobyhanna Township, Monroe County, a 2,300-acre preserve complex protected by Wildlands Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy, and Tobyhanna Township. Wildlands was seeking to improve access to a portion of the preserve. After an unsuccessful attempt to come to an agreement with an adjacent landowner to acquire their property, we turned our sights to the Plank property, a 72-acre property with forest cover, abundant wetlands, and an ideal spot for creation of access with parking and a trailhead. Among the many conservation values of the property, it, along with the adjacent preserve, serves as a corridor between northern flying squirrel populations. Sorry, I couldn't help but include a charismatic fauna in the presentation. Only wish I had some in real life here. So the Plank property was owned by Robert Plank and his son, and Stephen Gladstone. So it's important to note that Stephen Gladstone was the power of attorney for the Plank property holdings, and Gladstone was also a broker and attorney with some questionable dealings in the past. Some might label him as shady. As an important side note, though, Gladstone was also a dog show judge. He traveled the world judging dog shows. So, during our negotiations, he would often email from foreign countries or use his assistant as an intermediary. But we were able to negotiate a deal on the property with one caveat, that we were to use his land services company for settlement. While not thrilled, it wasn't a deal breaker. So, fast forward about a year, we're able to fully fund the project and had completed all the due diligence. On Thursday, June 15th, we scheduled a closing date, and I submitted the deed we had drafted with all the required funder language. Now, it's important to note that this draft deed was sent to 3 people at the closing company, as well as Gladstone and his assistant. I also confirmed it via phone call with his assistant. The closing details and the draft deed were okay with them. His assistant reminded me that Gladstone would be out of the country for closing, but would sign ahead of time, and that he himself likely wouldn't be attending closing either. So, 2 weeks later, I arrived at the closing to find that the owner of Homestead Land Services was actually handling the closing, despite not being involved in the process until this point. He also mentioned that Gladstone's assistant would be attending, but that he had to run out to drive his mother because she was in town because Homestead's attorney had passed away. Let the closing begin. First, I'm presented with a HUD that's quite different than what we agreed to. There's different items, they haven't made the updates. Don't even get me started about the bizarre charges that they claimed were standard, all of which we just previously let slide. Needless to say, it took almost an hour to sort everything out. Finally, when they presented me with a signed deed, it was not the deed that we had drafted with the required funding language. They now claim to be unaware of that deed. On top of that, the deed they presented me with had a typed date of 2017, which had been crossed out and replaced with a May 2016 date, the change was initialed by the closing agent. Very sloppy, and hence dated more to a year prior to closing. Despite their insistence that it was fine, and me calling my attorney to tell them no, it was not, needless to say, we couldn't close and did not accept that deed. So we delayed the closing until they could get the proper deed to Gladstone. However, they claimed they weren't sure where he was or how to get in touch with him. So the closing delayed temporarily so they could locate him and get him to sign the correct deed, ideally a process that would hopefully only take a few days, overnight airmail being what it is. In the meantime, I informed our funding partners of the delay and researched international signing laws. So, boggled by how they weren't able to figure out where he was, and knowing that he'd planned to be in Australia, I decided to do some internet sleuthing with my friend Google, and then figure it out for myself. So let the researching begin. And that's actually him at a dog show. Anyway, much to my surprise, my searching led me to the American Kennel Club website and, dun dun dun, his obituary. He had actually died on June 12th. Now take note that it's now June 28th, and I had sent that draft deed and talked to them about closing on June 15th. I I immediately contacted our attorney, who attempted to contact the closing agent with great difficulty, but he eventually did get back with a long, rambling voicemail expressing his utter shock, such as my cat is expressing his utter shock. They claimed they had no idea, and what should we do to move forward? So another round of phone calls and emails to our funding partners to inform them that the closing was now indefinitely delayed because the owner was dead. And of course, confirming all the money for closing was wired back to the appropriate parties. That was a little scary. Anyway, adamant that we were still going to make this deal happen, we soldiered on. We had to deal with the estate and probate, and also Gladstone's death meant that he was no longer power of attorney, and we would need the planks to sign as well. And frankly, at this point, I was starting to question whether or not they actually existed and were still alive, since we'd never dealt with them so far. Thankfully, after dealing with all the hassle of the estate and questionable closing agency, we successfully closed on the property on December 15th, and you'll never believe it, both planks were actually at closing. Of course, this time around, I also brought our attorney. Of course, nothing is ever simple as it seems. 3 weeks later, I felt like this flying squirrel, because they still had not recorded the deed. After some harassment on my part, on January 12th, a full 4 weeks after closing, the deed was finally recorded. I have no clue when we'll receive the title insurance policy. The end.